Welcome to another ED+U class. I really appreciate you joining us. ED+U is just named for the idea that coffee education can be hard to find. Coffee is changing constantly. There's always new things to learn, and we're discovering so much about coffee all the time. And so the idea is to, again, not provide something that might be earth-shattering, right? But just an updated, as accurate as we can, kind of synopsis of specialty coffee and practices throughout the supply chain. And I really hope to turn this platform into a place where people can go to learn, but then also utilize these classes and teach from these classes yourself. So you have full permission to download this stuff and use it as you need. That's what it's designed for. So, like I said, this first series of classes we are launching with is called Coffee Is. We're exploring all the things that coffee is, right? You ask the question, what is coffee? To anybody, you're going to get a lot of different answers based on their experiences with it, whether they're part of the industry or not. And then if they work in the industry, what part of it, the industry, right? And so we're exploring all the things that coffee is throughout the supply chain within this series. This is part 3 of 6. In part 1, coffee is a plant. We're really focused on the biology of Coffea arabica specifically. We're looking at all its biological characteristics, its speciation, where arabica came from, how it expanded throughout the world, its natural habitat that it thrives in. In part 2, coffee is agriculture. We then introduce farming, right? So taking this species of plant and how is it produced? So we talk about the steps of coffee production from seed to harvest, um, and relate that to the life cycle of the plant and all the different kind of tasks per year a producer is undertaking. Um, Class 3, we're picking up where we left off. We left off in our last class at harvest. So post harvest steps, right? We're talking about processing, drying, and then milling the coffee before export. Um, like the previous class, we're not really talking about commercializing the coffee as kind of part of this process. The next class is all about coffee commercialization. This class is very focused on the biological, the mechanical steps involved with taking that fruit and converting it into that raw green coffee product that's ready for export, ready for roasting, right? So, like with every class, um, there's a huge amount of variance in practices depending on where you are in the world, right? There's no way we can kind of encapsulate all of the nuance of processing in all these different places, but hopefully we can kind of, you know, peek through the keyhole into the world behind this door, to just have a greater understanding of like how much freedom and experimentation is within processing, but also looking at like what has been practiced for a long time that has kind of laid the foundation for all the processing innovations that are taking place today, right? And then just the importance of milling, the impact that that has on the cup, um, and maybe the little steps within milling that we might not often hear about. You know, milling isn't something that I knew a ton about when I first started in coffee. I heard a lot about processing, not as much about milling. So hopefully we get a good coverage of kind of both of these processes that happened post harvest, right? So what is a process is the question we're asking here. Just like what is coffee, here we are asking what is a process. So we're going to kind of start in a very generic level, just look at a basic definition of process, and then we'll dive into applying that word to coffee. So a process as a noun is the series of actions or steps taken to achieve a particular end. Um, to process, which is usually kind of how we're using it, right? As a verb, a something we are doing to the coffee. When we are processing the coffee, we are performing a series of mechanical or chemical operations on something to change and or preserve it. And I think this is a great definition because of that change and preserve aspect. Both of these are things are happening to coffee throughout the processing, throughout the drying, and throughout the milling. We are changing the makeup of the seed, right? Um, at a mechanical level and at a chemical level And then we are preserving that seed to make it ready for export, to make it easier to roast, which then leads to the brewing, right? Coffee is constantly going through change and preservation throughout really every step, you could argue, right? But as we discussed in class two, the way coffee is handled in its processing and in its milling is subject to many human decisions, right? So kind of going back to that first definition, that particular end, lots of things influence what that particular end goal is with this coffee, right? So there's tradition, creativity, tried and true methods, market trends, um, fluctuations in the market, environmental restrictions, how much space a producer has, or efficiency is a massive factor in processing. Costs, which change year to year to year, right? All of these things will kind of move that goalpost on like what is trying to be achieved with this coffee in particular, right? And so again, there's a million tiny variables we can't capture in 1 2 hour class, absolutely. But hopefully, again, we kind of start at a very simple level, and then we can kind of see the layers of complexity and nuance and creativity that can then take place upon like the most kind of essential concepts of processing first. So, what is processing? These are kind of the two parts of the class we're going to look at, where there's a little third part there in the middle between these two that we'll discuss as well. But processing is post-harvest. So the fruit is harvest. What are the steps taken to remove or keep the fruit layers around that seed, and then drying that coffee seed before milling and exporting, right? So that is kind of a basic definition of coffee processing, right? We keep in mind that kind of verb definition we discussed earlier, the series of actions to change and preserve it. Um, Processing is a lot of change, and then in the drying phase, we are preserving it, and then milling is kind of the continuation of that preservation, right? So milling is post-processing. So after that seed has been thoroughly dried, the post-processing steps to remove the last final parchment layer around the seed, and then cleaning, sorting, grading those green coffee seeds into bagged lots ready for export. All right, so we're going to kind of dive into all these little individual steps within these two basic definitions and then extrapolate from there. But again, that kind of change and preservation. This is something we'll keep in mind as we're going throughout this. Um, Change and preservation occur throughout all the post-harvest processes. The way coffee is processed, in particular, the way that fruit is removed or maintained, can often dictate kind of like that loudness of flavor, right? The approach to processing really does change what is held within that seed. And we're going to kind of dive into that. While milling contributes to the shelf life, the roastability of the coffee. So I know I keep saying it, but there's an infinite number of variables at play that can be slightly tweaked or adjusted. That might change all the other levers in the room throughout coffee's journey, right? All of this impacts the flavor in the final cup. It's hard to say A plus B equals C in terms of flavor. And these decisions are really complex, but our goal today outline the most kind of common practices and then the impact those steps have on the cup, and then hopefully kind of open our minds to the amount of variation that can take place from region to region, farm to farm, harvest to harvest, plant to plant, right? And that's kind of the most beautiful thing about coffee is the infinite of it and how unique every experience is. And processing and milling absolutely a kind of a tribute to that spectrum of coffee and why it's such a loved product, right? So um, uh, basic kind of objectives for today. We're going to look at the essential processing methods, washed honey, natural, outline those. Then after that, we'll kind of layer on that when we talk about fermentation, discussing what fermentation is and what the key variables are involved in fermentation, and then how that fermentation can be applied to those kind of core washed honey and natural processes. Um, and that's objective three, fermentation points within washed honey and natural to kind of manipulate those processes. Then we'll look at drying, methods, materials, and impact. And then we'll look at milling. What are the milling steps? Why are they important? So processing, fermentation, drying, and milling. Those are the four big things we're going through today. So as we get into this here, Again, ask questions at any time, use the chat, however you'd like to communicate. We'll take some breaks. There's some videos in here. Hopefully, we've got great pictures and illustrations to kind of help us put these things together. Processing for me feels like a step one, step two, step three, right? But it's very much not like that. It's a kind of continuous ebbing and flowing, you know, slightly different from place to place process. And it's kind of hard to connect between step one, two, and three. What are all the little variations, or what is the movement from place to place of coffee, right? It's one of those things that until you see it firsthand, it might be hard to grasp everything involved with it. But hopefully these videos and photos kind of help maybe fill in some of those little gaps between the steps that we're talking about today. And that's the hardest thing to communicate. But processing is really complex and super different depending on where you are. So, real quick, let's talk about the people behind processing. Um, is there one word that you could use to describe the farmer, producer, and processor? Is a question. This is kind of what this is speaking to. These aren't like, industry standard words, farmer, producer, processor, right? These are ways that we have defined these words for ourselves, especially when it comes to our impact standards and how we're buying coffee and how we are labeling things. Um, we have somebody who doesn't process but grows coffee as a farmer, a producer being someone who grows and processes coffee, and then a processor is a person or entity that processes coffee but doesn't grow, right? They might collect cherry from farmers and then process it, right? So that is another kind of complex factor within processing and milling is who are the actors involved, right? Is it one person who's growing and processing coffee, or is it changing hands one or multiple times throughout these steps? Um, this is something you could like spend a lot of time charting out from country to country to country, but there's lots of different practices. So, kind of applying this to maybe different entities within a place. Who is processing? A producer, somebody who grows and processes the coffee, maybe a neighboring producer. So, if somebody farms and maybe takes cherry to a neighbor who processes, a wet mill or a processor. There's multiple names for this kind of entity, right? We think of like Ethiopia, for example, where there's wet mills in different areas that serve a village or a few different villages, right? Small farmers bringing all of their cherry to one central wet mill, and that wet mill processes the coffee, and then that coffee moves on to the next entity, right? Um, these can be private or government owned. Maybe a private company goes and establishes a wet mill super focused on, um, you know, high quality coffees. So they say, we're going to build a wet mill in this area, serve these producers, and give producers a way to process and market their coffees through a private company, right? Exporters, kind of a similar thing that I was just talking to, but they also take that processed coffee, maybe mill it and export it, right? So they handle the shipping of it in-house. Cooperatives or associations, right? Groups of producers who come together, they have a wet mill, so all their coffee is processed there, right? Like this is where it's hard to kind of outline all these changing of hands. The supply chain is often far more complex than we think of it, is kind of the main point here, right? Um, but kind of keeping that in mind, let's now kind of get into the premise of processing as a whole and then washed honey and natural. So, revisiting the anatomy of a coffee fruit. Many, many, many layers, right? There's the fruit skin on the very outside, the exocarp. There's the mucilage, so that shiny, dense fruit surrounding the seed. Remember that mucilage is extremely stuck to the seed, right? Like you could squeeze seeds out of a fruit, put those seeds in your mouth and chew, try and scrape that fruit off, but it's very strong. It's hard to like break down that fruit in your mouth in a short amount of time. It's not like fruit that just comes off the seed like other fruits, right? So the skin, the mucilage, and then the pectin layer, the thin layer under the mucilage, which is still kind of part of that fruit. All those things, that pectin and mucilage, are very stuck to the seed. These are kind of like the main three things that we're involved in processing, right? These are the layers we are either removing or keeping before drying. And we're going to get into that. So those three are highlighted there. Underneath that, you have the parchment. The parchment is like a shell around the seed. The mucilage is stuck to that parchment, but that parchment is a protective layer of the seed itself, right? You've got the silver skin, which is the very thin, papery layer on the seed. The endosperm is kind of the seed structure itself, and then the endosperm fold there in the middle. But those four layers are not really involved in processing. Um, these three layers are what we are manipulating in the processing steps, right? So we're going to kind of keep that skin and fruit in mind as we move into these ones here. So what layers are removed before drying? How are they removed? That's the basic premise of processing, right? What are we drying on the seed once that coffee goes to being laid out to dry? In washed coffee, we are removing the skin and the mucilage. So um, we're basically taking everything off the seed and then drying it. In honey processing, we are removing the skin, but we are leaving the mucilage intact on the seed. So some of the fruit is drying on the coffee seed. In natural processing, we are leaving all of the fruit on the seed, right? So there's really kind of two layers, skin and the fruit. If we take off the skin and fruit, it's washed. If we take off the skin but leave the fruit, it's honey. And if we leave everything on, it's a natural. Um, I feel like washed honey natural are pretty common words nowadays. The terms used to be wet and dry, wet being washed, dry being natural, semi-washed being honey. Again, this is kind of where language naming is all kind of like a made up thing in coffee, right? It's constantly evolving as new methods come about. Um, but there's also really old methods that are more localized that might have basic similar steps as these. Um, but we'll have a chart that kind of breaks down a lot of common processing here in a little bit. But what fruit is being removed, what fruit is left on at the seed when it comes to drying, right? So that's where we're kind of picking up from harvest, sorting the fruit out, and then it goes through whichever process. So now we're going to kind of get deeper into the steps of washed honey and natural here. What happens to the removed material? That's another really great question. We'll kind of touch on uh, byproducts as we're going through each of these steps. So bear with me here, and we'll kind of touch on that removed material, those waste products. So this is where we get to our videos. I thought about if you've seen these processing videos before, I'm sorry, but they're good refreshers. If you haven't seen these again are on our YouTube. Let me make sure I have my computer set to share audio. You might have to play with your volume. I'm going to try to not talk during these, just in case like volume is really weird. I'm also going to drop the YouTube link. So if I start it and you don't hear it, you can just open this on YouTube and go and watch it yourself and then meet back here with us. Um, but we're going to watch these, I think, video, again, it's a great way to kind of see the nuance of these steps in one particular place. And then we'll kind of look more broadly at these steps. So let's go ahead, sit back, watch these videos. This one's all about wash processing. I'll double check to make sure it works for you here in a second. All right. So again, great video to kind of show all these little steps that we aren't even outlining in these flow charts we're going to look at now. But basic idea of washed, remove the skin, remove the mucilage, dry the coffee, right? And so this is where you can see like there's lots of variation that can occur. This producer in particular depulped the coffee to remove the skin. So a depulper is just kind of like a grinder, right? It squeezes the seeds, separates the skin from those seeds. The seeds still have the mucilage. This producer in particular kind of piles the seeds in a tank with no water to ferment. So it's kind of like an open air, just pile fermentation, no water involved, and that breaks down the mucilage. You may see producers add water at the very beginning of of this fermentation, and it ferments in water. You'll see plenty of vessels, different kinds of vessels the coffee might be fermented in. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but we're removing the skin and then the washing, the fermentation and actual washing to remove the mucilage, sorting and drying, right? So there's plenty of steps you could break this down into as well. There's also mechanical demucilaginators. They're basically depulpers, right? They're just calibrated more closely to grind off the skin and the fruit. Those will go even quicker, right? They're a lot more efficient in terms of like you're not doing a fermentation time, but you risk kind of breaking seeds and damage that way. But there's kind of multiple paths there that you could go to remove the mucilage, right? But depulp the skin, wash off the mucilage, dry the coffee. So lots of costs involved, right? We talk about this method being very efficient. For a long time, in many countries, most coffee that was exported was washed because it's considered very clean. You have minimal risk of, over fermenting the coffee if there's fruit remaining on the coffee while it dries. But it requires equipment, it requires water, it requires places to hold that coffee while it is with water, right? Tanks, channels, whatever the means might be. So constructing an actual wet mill to do this can be expensive, right? And then maintaining that wet mill. You also have byproducts. You have fruit skin and used water. This video kind of spoke to it. The fruit skin, you're either just discarding it or you can compost it. Maybe even make a fertilizer, like an organic kind of fertilizer to apply to the farm. The used water, yeah, it needs to be cleaned. It needs to be filtered out to be usable again. You don't want to just drain it into groundwater or natural water nearby because that is not great for the environment, right? And so that water and that fruit skin has to go somewhere, and it needs to go somewhere carefully. Um, Drying time is pretty quick because you're just drying the seeds. There's not layers of fruit on the seed. It can dry like on a patio in that example, maybe 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the conditions it's drying in. We'll kind of speak more to that later. And flavor profile wise, what we have listed, is a coffee that comes out not super heavy, right? It's not a super heavy texture, or, very fruit forward. It's a little more delicate. Wide spectrum of potential fruit acidities, articulate flavors. We think of kind of like more the crisp, complex, brighter coffees, depending on how it's roasted, obviously, right? But more delicate cups overall in terms of flavor intensity and mouthfeel. So that's wash processing. Now we're going to get into honey, right? So with honey, we are removing the skin, but we are leaving some amount of mucilage on the seed. So said we're kind of going through these videos first, and then we'll kind of tie it all here together at the end. Here's the link for the honey processing video. I will let this one run. And again, if you have questions in between or during these videos, throw them in the chat. We will definitely get to them. All right, so honey processing. Honey processing was like heavily popularized by Costa Rican producers. Kind of like 2012, I think, was like one of the first honey lots won a Cup of Excellence competition there. And from there, it really took off. La Candelia was one of the first micro mills that really popularized it. And then the Chacones at Las Lajas have really taken off with it as well. But as it was said, it's kind of this like almost 50-50, this compromise between a washed coffee and a fully natural coffee, right? We're leaving some mucilage on or all of the mucilage on to dry the coffee. So you're still depulping the coffee, you're still getting the fruit skin off, but then you're leaving that mucilage layer intact, and sugars, fats, acids, esters within that fruit layer, they're fermenting on the seed during the drying, and those components, those compounds may be absorbed into the seed, changing that coffee as it dries, right? Resulting in a really big spectrum of flavor profiles you could get from honey processing. We talked about how if you remove most of that mucilage in the depulping, might be a white honey, to yellow to red, and then a black honey would be leaving all of the mucilage on. It turns like a black color as it dries on the patio, right? So costs, you still have equipment. The drying time is extended. And again, when you leave fruit on the seed, laying out in the sun, there is a chance of over fermentation, essentially rotting, right? So you are at risk, more risk for defect forming during just that drying step. You will still have fruit skin and maybe water as a byproduct, and that drying time extends from 1 to 2 weeks to now 2 to 3, even 4 weeks, depending on, if it's covered or open, different things like that. But, as it talked about in the video, pretty big gambit of flavor profiles you can get, but they tend to be a little fruitier. They tend to be a little heavier in texture. You may get more kind of caramelized notes. More in your face sweetness than you would with a washed coffee, especially depending on kind of the grade of honey that is being produced here, right? The big idea, removing the skin, keeping the mucilage. So now we get to the oldest processing method, natural processing, right? We're just drying the seed with all of the fruit left on it. So you're drying whole cherries in natural processing. Again, natural is kind of the oldest way. Washed kind of became the standard bearing way for many places. And nowadays, almost all these coffee producing countries that export coffee will export any of these methods. And then there's more methods from here, right? As we're going to dive into fermentation. But let's watch our natural process video, and then we'll kind of get back to the slideshow here. This video is great. Again, it kind of shows where coffee comes from. Ethiopia, oldest processing method. These places, a lot of these places in Ethiopia really have it perfected. So another example of different drying elements too, right? We're going to talk about drying more in depth, but you can see at Las Lajas, totally different drying areas for different outcomes. Same with that washed coffee in Peru. Now you're going to get a lot of different kind of manipulation in the drying step here in Ethiopia. So let's watch this one. All right, so natural processing, right? It's fairly straightforward. Just drying the full cherries, right? But the complexity of natural comes in controlling the drying, right? You just lay it out, put it all in a pile. It's going to develop mold or just over ferment, becoming super sour, almost alcoholic, in the final flavor profile. It takes a long time to dry naturals, right? It takes up a lot more space to dry naturals. So there's kind of like the amount of real estate and the amount of time you have. Processing and drying in particular is always a bottleneck in terms of exporting coffee, right? It's going to take an X amount of time to dry the coffee. So how much space do you have kind of balancing that, right? So those are the costs here. You don't have as many byproducts, at the processing level. All that stuff will be hauled off in the milling step. So space and drying time are really the greatest kind of cost factors here. Drying time around 4 weeks, depending on the methods. And then, if it's exposed fully to sun, how humid it is, etc. Oftentimes with drying, and this goes for really all processes, overnight, if temperatures get cool, like no drying is happening throughout the night. There's no moisture release at night, but then during the day, it'll reaccelerate. Constant turning the coffee over to make sure all sides are drying evenly is really, really important here. So Michael makes the note, seems more labor intensive. Yeah, I think you could argue like all of these, there's a lot of movement. There could be equipment or not as much equipment involved. But there's a lot of transporting between all of these steps, right? And depending on how much coffee is moving through a washing station, it is a lot of labor for sure. And the processing itself, one place I've been to, processing is kind of 3 months long, basically, until like the actual wet mill part is done and coffee's just finally laying out to dry. But it's kind of a almost a 24-hour a day operation, depending how big of a mill it is. So like in a place like Ethiopia, it's almost constant work probably going on to produce those washed and those natural coffees, depending on how much they're collecting, right? So those are our basic processes, kind of the calling them like our core three that we're kind of build on these when we talk about fermentation. Harvest and sort. If it goes to washing, you're depulping the skin, removing the mucilage via fermentation and washing, sorting and drying. If it's going the honey route, you're going to depulp still, so you still have that equipment involved, but then it goes to drying. And then if it's natural, you're skipping the depulping, going straight to drying, right? But like we've seen, there's tons of nuance at and in between each and every one of these steps, right? So this is where we get into fermentation. Fermentation is really where we start to hear a lot more about different kinds of processing methods, right? We talk about aerobic, anaerobic, carbonic maceration, co-fermented, all of these different things. So we're going to kind of dive into the complexity of fermentation, kind of where creativity and maybe a lot more innovation is coming into coffee processing, right? Fermentation is really fascinating. We know about fermentation from different foods that we eat. Fermentation is a very old method of preserving and changing food, right? So fermentation is almost kind of like a process in terms of that transform or change and preserve thing we were talking about at the beginning of the class. But within coffee processing, fermentation is usually kind of like one isolated step within those greater processes, right? So we've kind of started out with washed honey and natural, and now we're going to deep dive into fermentation and then see the different ways fermentation can be used within those processes to kind of modulate or alter that core processing method. So we're going to start out more basic, discussing what fermentation is kind of on a cellular level, because that's where fermentation happens. And then we'll look at the different kind of variables applied to coffee processing, and how fermentation can be used in coffee. So these are different definitions of fermentation. The definition of fermentation is changing constantly. There's one really kind of great paper on fermentation and kind of how it's used nowadays that outlines all these different definitions. It's in the cited sources for this class, which I will give you access to here in a second. It's in that link. But let's go through these. So 1300s is kind of the first written definition of it. Fervor is Latin, it meant to boil. So ancient Romans, they saw grapes in vats spontaneously start bubbling. It looks like boiling. So that's where kind of the root word comes from. In the 1850s, Louis Pasteur, known for his discoveries in terms of, vaccination, microbial fermentation, and pasteurization. He describes fermentation as life in the presence of oxygen, or in the absence of oxygen, excuse me, which is a really great, simple definition of fermentation. And we're going to talk about how that works. But nowadays, we think of fermentation as a way to transform food by using microorganisms like bacteria, yeast, and mold, right? Kimchi, miso, kombucha, soy sauce, sourdough bread, cheese, alcoholic beverages, they are all products where fermentation is integral in creating them, right? Those are all products of fermentation. Um, Fermentation, like drying, smoking, and salting, is one of the oldest methods of changing and preserving food and beverages, right? And it's a way of improving food's nutritional value. So, in that sense, fermentation is in the food world a biotechnology, right? Promotes and controls the growth of microorganisms. At a biological level, and this is what Pasteur is talking about, it is a pathway for a cell to perform respiration without oxygen. So let's look really quick at cellular respiration, because I think it kind of helps us understand just how complex fermentation is as a single step of processing. So cellular respiration is a three-step process. Glycolysis, where glucose or sugars are consumed, that produces pyruvate. Pyruvate helps power the Krebs cycle, which produces CO2 as a byproduct. And then the remaining molecules go through the electron transport chain, and all of this works together to create ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP is basically like packages of energy for our cells to continue doing whatever our cells need to do, right? So it helps cells survive or respirate, right? So this requires oxygen. Cellular respiration needs oxygen in this last step to produce all of that cellular energy, basically. Um, so the question here is what happens when there's no oxygen? We talked about fermentation being life in the absence of oxygen. If there is no oxygen available to a cell, there's two different routes that cell can go. Anaerobic respiration, which will basically do all of the same steps but replace oxygen with a different electron acceptor at the end, but that only produces 2 ATP. So not very much adenosine triphosphate. So when there's no oxygen, cells creating energy is a lot less efficient. So that's anaerobic respiration, or a cell might start doing fermentation, which still only produces 2 oxygen, but rather than doing those 3 steps, they will just perform glycolysis over and over. So it's consuming sugar and producing 2 ATP constantly while also producing another byproduct. That other byproduct, let's see here in two different fermentation examples, might be ethanol. So that's alcoholic fermentation, right? Beer, wine. This is the glycolysis producing ethanol to ATP, and that cycle just kind of going over and over again. And then there's lactic acid fermentation. We think of like yogurt. Um, this is the pathway to perform glycolysis, producing ATP into lactate. So fermentation, to kind of wrap it up, is a metabolic process where a microorganism, right, only specific cells can do fermentation. Bacteria, yeast, and molds most commonly can do fermentation. They're able to basically produce energy without oxygen by performing glycolysis over and over. So what this requires is sugar. There has to be a fuel source. There has to be food for that cell to consume, perform glycolysis. They get that cellular energy, but there's also that byproduct, that waste product. So this is the lactic acid pathway. This is the alcoholic pathway. There's multiple different kinds of fermentation that produce multiple byproducts, right? So but you can kind of see the mechanics here. It's this NAD plus is needed to restart. Basically, this pyruvate is split into lactate, NAD plus, and ATP, and that allows it to then just trigger all over again, right? Um, so that product that we get in the outcome, like lactic or acetic acid or ethanol, that's really in coffee processing what we want in the fermentation, right? We want those byproducts, along with lots of esters are produced in this, things that become volatile aromatics. Those are the things that transform the food, essentially, right? So we're going to start applying this to coffee here in a minute, but this is a really great chart that shows all the different pathways. So we just looked at alcoholic, lactic acid, these colors represent other pathways, basically different byproducts different kinds of cells will produce in their fermentation, right? And then there's two main ways for fermentation to go. There can be spontaneous or wild fermentations, right? So this is just indigenous, like native or indigenous microflora um, triggering fermentation. Or you can add starter cultures, right? Culture dependent fermentations, where you are intentionally adding a population of bacteria, yeast, or mold to kind of control the fermentation, control the outcome, right? In a spontaneous fermentation, whatever microbes are present, they're going to produce whatever they produce, right? You won't be able to predict the outcome as much. But yeah, these colors represent different pathways, different interactions, resulting in different final products. And the amount of microbes that exist is huge, right? There's tons of yeast bacteria and molds out there. So these colors again represent what we just looked at on the last chart. And these, yeah, are different populations of organisms that can go through fermentation, and then all the different things they can consume and then produce. So when we think about a coffee farm, you think about a wet mill, all the microbes that are present in those areas, right? Microbes are on every single surface. All of those things are at play when it comes to fermentation. In one of those videos, it mentioned that as soon as coffee is picked, right, as soon as it's harvested, there's a hole in the cherry. Any bacteria that can get through that entry point, it will start fermenting the fruit inside of that fruit, right? So, in my mind, fermentation is kind of a miraculous thing, right? There's an extreme number of these organisms that can ferment, and they all produce different byproducts depending on their environment, right? So, um, the other part is many organisms can be active at the same time in one kind of, localized fermentation place, right? So, fermentation and processing. Let's kind of tie this back into processing. First big point, fermentation occurs in all processing methods, right? We just spoke to that. As soon as microbes have an entry point to fruit, which contains sugar, they can begin fermenting, right? Intentional fermentation is a step within a greater process. Often we hear maybe the term anaerobic fermentation, or anaerobic process. And we kind of think like, okay, this process is all about the fermentation, but that doesn't really tell us all the other steps that became before or after the fermentation, right? You can ferment coffee in a oxygen-free environment in a washed honey or a natural process. So fermentation is not a process in and of itself, but it's a step, or it could be multiple steps within a greater process. So point three I want to make here is that processing methods, especially the newer processing methods, they're often named for intentional manipulations of a single step, kind of leaving all of the other steps to be assumed, right? So a lot of times when we hear about a new fermentation process, we are being told what maybe the environment was like, right? What the fermentation step was like, and then we're just kind of left to guess what the rest of the stuff was. But historically, the primary purpose of fermentation and processing is to break down that mucilage layer, right? Fermentation is really, really effective at breaking down mucilage, but when fermentation is controlled, it can add a ton of flavor compounds, right? Volatile aromatics, new acids to the coffee in a desirable way. And so that's where we get into like more controlled fermentations, bringing something new to the coffee. So before we watch this video, Thomas asked, are there specific bacteria added to the coffee to control flavors, or is it only bacteria already in or on the fruit? There are instances of both. Usually, like in the washed video we just watched, or the natural, that coffee isn't put in a specific environment and a yeast or a starter culture isn't added to it. So that is just a spontaneous fermentation in most instances, but there are producers, processors who are making starter dependent cultures, adding those to the fermentation step to kind of get a desired outcome. There's like citric fermentations, lactic fermentations, acetic fermentations, where they're controlling the populations of microbes to kind of get those things to be produced essentially. But more often than not, you are either seeing spontaneous fermentation or maybe kind of a combination of both, right? So fermentation, again, it's kind of like there's no rules. Uh, we're going to look at variables that can be manipulated um, to kind of alter the conditions to where certain bacterias or things may thrive. But yeah, we're going to watch a video on anaerobic fermentation because this has become a pretty common term, right? A pretty common practice in specialty coffee. We'll see one instance of it, and then we can kind of extrapolate from there. Simon says there are producers that do inoculants. Koji is another example, exactly. Um, When you inoculate something, you are adding a community of microbes. That new community overwhelms the other microbes, and that community kind of takes control over the entire fermentation to get something you want out of it. Um, in the cited sources, which I can drop the link to this presentation at the end. All the cited sources are there with the links. You can visit them. Um, there's a couple different articles about inoculants and kind of how it works to get certain outcomes. And there's a couple of people on Instagram and YouTube who are making videos on this too that are really, really good. I think I have a couple of them linked there as well. But let's watch this anaerobic fermentation video together. That'll be it for the videos today. And then we'll keep rolling here. But yeah, any other questions? Throw them in. Here's the anaerobic link. All right, let's play this one. All right, so yeah, I think that video is a great way of showing just like one very specific way of doing a specific kind of fermentation and how that can be applied to any of the greater kind of core processes we've talked about, right? Um, and we're going to get into kind of the variables that can be manipulated within a fermentation step. But again, it's kind of it's vast in terms of like what microbes are present in a specific area, what thrives in a certain condition, and what works best with your particular coffee, your particular variety, right? It requires a lot of experimentation to really kind of find a recipe that works, right? And that farm in particular, they have their recipe. They choose to dry it natural. They could do washed or honey. And you could insert that step into a lot of different areas within one of those processes we've talked about, right? So commonly you can see a fermentation step um, done to the whole fruit, right? Before anything else is done with it. And then it could keep following the normal track, right? So in an anaerobic washed, for example, you could ferment the whole fruit, depulp it, remove the mucilage through another fermentation, just, kind of agitation in water, maybe sort it and dry it, right? In honey processing, you could ferment it before depulping. You could skip that. You could depulp and then ferment it in a tank. Then you could dry it, right? So you could do before or after, or you could do a combination of both, right? There's no rules. It's all about kind of coming up with, again, that recipe. In natural coffee, like we just saw, ferment it, and then dry it, right? So there's multiple points of fermentation in each step that you could apply to any processing method. So the process, what will be on the seed once that seed dries? Washed honey, natural, right? The modulation is kind of what I'm calling this fermenting step. When and how will the coffee be fermented? And oftentimes these newer processing methods are named for the modulation rather than the entire process, but that might not tell us the full story of what that coffee underwent, right? But many processing modulations kind of stem from the core concept of what is on the seed when that coffee dries, but that fermentation will totally alter that flavor profile and the outcome, right? So, um, that is, let's see, what do we have next? Let's just go to the next slide. So, talking about some variables with fermentation, removing kind of microflora from the picture right now, right? What is at the farm? What is at the processing site? What are the microbes that are present? Other variables that can be like manipulated are the environment, the amount of time, the temperature of the fermentation area, inoculants, and additives, right? So with the environment is going to kind of determine a lot of the other variables for sure, right? It heavily changes kind of the kinetics of the fermentation, how well it holds temperature, how well it holds in or lets out oxygen or gases. Um, and all of that is going to impact the time that the coffee ferments, right? So you have open tanks. That tank could be made with concrete, could be made with tile, closed tanks. plastic bags, just piling the coffee up in a tank or on a patio, right? So fermentation, like we've talked about, it's going to happen, and you can allow that fermentation to happen any place in particular, right? The amount of time is really a predetermined thing with fermentation. You're not going to get the exact same rate of fermentation every batch. So the time is going to change. You can draw it out by manipulating temperature, right? Higher temperature usually means a quicker fermentation. A cooler temperature might mean a slower fermentation, adding water. All those kinds of things are going to manipulate the time, but the things that are going to be tracked are these measurables here, right? pH. Some producers might track the Brix throughout the fermentation, the temperature, the color, taste, of the byproduct, like that water that was drained out, right? The bubble activity. All of these things are indicators of kind of when that fermentation is getting going and then when it's coming to an end, right? And so all that kind of comes down to that particular recipe when you decide to pull that coffee from the fermentation. But you're tracking it constantly. Um, Next, you have temperature. Different temperatures are going to favor different organisms, and then how quickly that organism can proliferate in terms of its fermentation, right? So temperature can be something you intentionally control for an outcome. We see that with like what's the process I'm thinking of? Um, I'll pull it up here in a second. Let me go to it real quick. Yeah, like thermal shock, where you are fermenting the coffee and then you are adding cold water to like shock the fermentation to make it come to a complete halt. So you can manipulate the temperature. And then inoculants or additives, right? Inoculants being adding microorganisms, a population of microorganisms, or adding non-coffee products, right? Fruit, spices, juices, the microorganisms will use that as fuel, which will produce more stuff in the fermentation, right? And so, um, there are some practices too that might feel brand new that have been practiced for years. One of our grain buyers, Omar in Colombia, said, there's a place where coffee's been being produced for a long time. The producers there have been doing anaerobic fermentation for generations, but it was never marketed that way, right? And so different producers find different recipes. They just find things that work with their coffee. But introducing a totally new fermentation technique can be really expensive, right? It can take a lot of time and a lot of materials. And there's a risk that that method might not be as in high demand in years to come, right? So this is another kind of like assumed risk by the processor to try these new fermentation methods. Experimentation is key in producing a good recipe, right? So I forgot to click through these different pictures here, but lots of different environments, lots of different recipes that can be come up with that work. But here's kind of a chart of different fermentation methods, right? Anaerobic, like we just looked at, aerobic, which is just an open air kind of environment, carbonic maceration, which is a method pulled from the wine industry, right, and applied to coffee. Um, Thermal shock, lactic acid, and yeast ferments. Those rely on starter cultures. Um, and then co-ferments, and there's many others that are coming out. These are just some of like the more common ones that we hear of nowadays when it comes to fermentation. So kind of continuing on this track before we get into drying and milling, which we'll go fairly quick through, just to kind of break it all down, everything we've talked about, thinking about one fermentation environment. There's kind of three steps going on within a fermentation environment. Step one, the fermentation itself, where, the microbes are present, what microbes will thrive, and then what kind of sugar is available. That kind of determines what fermentation pathway is going to start happening with that in environment, right? Then there's diffusion. So all of these new molecules are being generated in the fermentation, these new compounds. What is produced? Are those things small enough to travel into the seed, right? Some things that are produced in the fermentation, those molecules will be too large to travel into the membrane. And then there's how long does diffusion take? How long does it take for those new things generated to get into the seed? Is that seed in the environment long enough to absorb those new things? And then pathways. Does the molecule change as it's diffusing into the seed, right? As it's going from high concentration to low concentration. Some compounds might not change. Some compounds might be consumed by the seed's metabolism and change. They might be consumed by other microbes and turn into another new thing. And they might chemically react with what's already around it, right? So, all this to say is like, we can do lots of tests in labs. That's not always going to translate to the environment, right? Things are constantly changing throughout the fermentation, and then those things have to get into the seed, right, to impact the cup. So it's hard to track all of these tiny, infinite changes that are going on within a fermentation environment. So lots of complexity, very hard to replicate. Um, but these are kind of the big three mechanics that work, right? So this study does a really good job of indicating that. This is also something you can go read. This is 10 farms in Brazil that were studied. They were able to find out what are all of the bacteria and fungi that are active on these farms. What was the rate of consumption of glucose and fructose in the fermentation environment? And then what was produced in that fermentation environment of ethanol, lactic acid, acetic acid, and citric acid? And then they were able to identify volatile compounds produced in the fermentation and then kind of say whether those were derived from plant microbes or microbes in the fermentation environment. And then they kind of interlinked all of it, right? So I'm not going in depth into this, but it's a great way of kind of illustrating, again, that kind of the complexity of the relationships. Everything's kind of tied together. When you change one variable, it's going to change this entire picture, right? Of the volatile compounds and major compounds produced in the fermentation. So, um, innovative fermentation techniques, while they are, potentially effective at increasing coffee qualities, they do require farmers who may not be earning a livable income to invest further into their facilities to be able to do these things, right? And so market demand, like we talked about, market demand changes, and that can expose farmers to risk. So managing all of these risks, learning new processes, it's easier said than done doing these things, right? But fermentation has become a thing that is really, really changing coffee and coffee profiles and what we expect to drink from coffee. And it's part of what makes this time period the best time to be a coffee drinker is we're getting so many new flavor experiences, and we can attribute a lot of that to fermentation. Cool. So that closes up that section. A little synopsis of fermentation. We're going to go through drying and milling. We've got 30 minutes left here in this class. I appreciate y'all hanging in there with me. Again, I know these virtual classes aren't always the most engaging, but hopefully there's something interesting in here. And then again, I will point you to all the cited sources where if you want to do any more reading on these topics, I have all those listed out for you. So, drying. What is drying? We've talked about drying a lot already. We're just going to kind of put a bow on it, give us a new way to hopefully think about drying. But drying is that final step of processing, right? You're laying that coffee out to dry, however much fruit is on it. When you pick a coffee cherry, it's around 50% moisture content. In the drying step, we're trying to get that coffee into a band somewhere between 9 and 14%. You're usually going to see under 12%, like 11% kind of being that ideal drying spot for the coffee seed. So, measuring the moisture content, 11% of a coffee seed being water. You can think of drying like curing, right? We're drawing moisture out of a food product, making it inhospitable to bacteria and other microbes that might cause the food to spoil, right? So this is basically making the coffee shelf stable until it makes its way to a roaster, can be held by a roaster until it's roasted, right? Where the seed is reaching an equilibrium with an environment where it's not changing or susceptible to microbial growth. Um, so lots of variables in drying. We've seen a lot of different drying methods, surfaces, facilities. We've talked about how the amount of fruit remaining and then all the kind of ambient variables, the temperature, humidity, direct light, all of those things are going to slow down or speed up the drying, right? Like we've also talked about, drying is a bottleneck. It takes a long time. So here's some of the main methods for drying coffee. I'm going to take a drink real fast. So you have patio drying, right? The surface is concrete, low airflow. You have to constantly turn this coffee over, especially in the first half of the drying time. The temperature is susceptible to fluctuation because it's just outside. Humidity is region and weather dependent. If it's really humid, it takes a long time to dry. And then direct light is shown to really take moisture out of coffee very, very quickly, right? So you are open to direct light, which can help speed up the drying. The biggest risk here is inconsistency in drying, right? You're very susceptible to whatever the elements, whatever the weather does. Raised beds, you're basically improving the airflow, right? The surface that it's drying on, it's off the ground. You have some sort of mesh or woven stuff under the coffee, so you get better airflow, which can help for more consistent drying. Still pretty exposed to the elements, so that will determine a lot of your drying time, right? Then you have parabolic dryers. So these are raised beds, but they're under like these greenhouses, right? There's a lot of different materials you can use to cover up the coffee, but the main thing you're eliminating here is one, you're having good airflow, and then two, you are adding a little bit of control to the temperature and the direct light, right? So typically, parabolic dryers slow the drying way, way, way down. And then you've got mechanical dryers, which is on the opposite end. It makes drying coffee really, really, really fast. You see this more often with commodity coffee. You might see it in areas where the humidity is really high and it's like impossible to dry coffee to that 11% moisture content. You might start it on a drying bed and then finish it in a mechanical dryer, but it's like a roaster that kind of sits, at a certain temperature, rotates the coffee around and just dries it out, right? It has been shown that temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, flavor precursors start to get damaged, right? So you don't want the temperature too hot. Otherwise, you're just kind of pre-roasting the coffee in a way. So the big kind of lesson um, with drying is typically the slower is better. The quicker you remove moisture, you kind of rip that moisture from the seed structure, you tend to also hurt all of those flavor precursors within the coffee. You tend to lose some of those. So usually slower holds quality more intact, but that means it's on the drying surface for a longer amount of time, right? Is the natural coffee dried again after milling? So the natural is going to fully dry. The seed content, moisture content will fully dry to that correct percent. So it doesn't need to be dried again after it's milled. No, it's a good question though, Thomas. They'll basically be taking seeds from the drying table and pulling them from the skin and then measuring the moisture content as it's going to know once it's done. So, good way to think about drying. A lot of this information came from our sensory team, who studied water activity and water activities impact on coffee. I'm not bringing up water activity to say this is something that should be measured by all producers because it's expensive to measure it. But it's a really good way of kind of understanding what equilibrium with the environment means, right? Why is 11% just kind of like that sweet spot for coffee? Water activity kind of tells us why. So we're going to define what moisture content and water activity. Moisture content is again just the amount of water in the seed, right? How much water is in this thing by percentage of its weight, right? So that's what we're measuring. That kind of 9 to 14%, that means 11% of this thing's weight is moisture. Water activity is a way of measuring the energy state of that moisture in the seed, right? So if you zoom in on a seed, seeds are kind of made up of this cellulose material, right? Interconnected, but there's these open spaces. Those open spaces hold stuff throughout the seed's life, like moisture, so that the seed can survive, right? So when we talk about the energy state of the water, we're basically talking about how free that water is, right? Is it just hanging out in the open space, or is that moisture integrated into the cellular structure of the seed? Water activity is basically a measurement of kind of the state of the moisture, right? How free versus kind of locked in that moisture is. A great way to think about it is like a sponge, right? You soak a sponge in water, you absorb water into it. When you take that sponge out, if you squeeze that sponge, a lot of it falls out, right? A lot of that water is free to just squeeze out of the sponge, but some moisture will still be kind of locked into the structure of the sponge. So that's kind of a good way to think about water activity, right? How much of this moisture is kind of integrated into the product, right? The more free water in a product, the closer you get to a 1.0 water activity. 0 to 1 is how it's measured. So the smaller the number, the more integrated that moisture is in that food product, right? The big thing is that the higher the water activity or the more free water there is, the more risk you have for microbial activity, molds, microtoxins. That's where in coffee you can get oxidation of fats or lipids. Like if a coffee is exported and its water activity is too high, you can lose a lot of flavor precursors or take on new flavors, right? So in coffee, zero point 0.7 is kind of like the sweet spot we found just on our personal account. If the moisture or the water activity is under zero point 0.7, most microbial activity is stopped. Mold spores can't proliferate. And what we see is that under 12% moisture content usually means you are under 0.7 water activity, right? So it's kind of like a way of basically retconning why 12% moisture content is kind of that natural number. That's usually where the water activity is low enough to stop microbial activity, right? So another good way to think about this is which product, a raisin or a cereal, has higher moisture content. A raisin has a lot more moisture within it, right? Cereal is pretty dry. Raisins are pretty moist products. But then if you think about which product molds easier, right? Cereal tends to develop mold much better or much more quickly than a raisin will, right? You can store a raisin for a long time. So even though there's more moisture in a raisin, its water activity is lower. That moisture is more integrated into the product versus cereal, where there's not as much moisture, but what moisture is there is pretty free to microbial activity, right? So, coffee needs a little bit of moisture, but we don't want to remove moisture that is integrated in the seed. That hurts the structure of the seed, but we don't want so much moisture in the seed that microbial growth can start to take place, right? Um, so that's kind of what we're talking about with drying, right? Slow, even drying tends to produce a better product, right? Getting coffee under 12% moisture content limits water activity. That equals a more shelf stable product, right? When we talk about stable, it means it's at equilibrium with its environment. It's not at risk to microbial growth. So, um, that's kind of coffee drying in a nutshell, right? Multiple ways to get to that final product. We're not talking much about like flavor precursors in drying right there. I'll show a little chart in a minute to how that correlates, right? Length of drying time, how that relates to flavor. But if you want to learn more about water activity, we've published a study on our website. It's on the sensory analysis section. It's really, really interesting to learn about. So, keep it going on these steps. After coffee is dried, it usually rests 1 to 4 weeks at the farm or at the wet mill before it goes to the dry mill where it will be milled and bagged. There's not a lot of research on this like really specific small step, but the coffee's taken off the drying beds, maybe put in sacks for delivery, but it just sits at the farm for a little bit longer before it transports. In our experience, usually 1 week to 1 month seems to kind of be the average amount of time before that coffee is delivered, just to kind of let it rest for a little bit. And then it is time for milling. So, um, considerations with drying, we've talked a lot about these. What processing methods do you have? Therefore, how long will it take those lots to dry? How many lots do you have? How much space do you have? And then the lower moisture content usually means that coffee weighs less. So it's going to take longer and you'll need more seeds to fill a bag to kind of hit that weight of the bag, right? So it takes a long time to really thoroughly dry coffee well. So to kind of tie processing, drying, and flavor all together, at World of Coffee this past year, ZA Coffee Excellence Center in Zurich presented a new study that they're about to put out, where they looked at processing method and drying time in Kenya and their effect on the presence of volatile aromatics in green coffee. I'm excited for the full thing to come out, but what they found is that like the more fruit left on the seed and the longer the drying time, the greater the presence of volatile aromatics, right? So that's a big takeaway here. The more fruit you have, or the longer the fermentation, and then the longer the drying time, you tend to keep more aromatics intact. So this is like quick washed, a honey, a natural, and then an extended drying natural. And it took the longest amount of time. It has the most amount of volatile aromatics. So it's a really interesting study. I'll definitely keep people updated when it's out because it was really well done. And a good look at fermentation and drying at an actual farm and not in a lab. But yeah, longer drying, more fruit, usually results in more volatile aromatics. That doesn't mean the coffee's better. It just means it's going to have more of these flavor compounds that can be played with in a coffee roaster, right? So, wrapping up here, losing my voice for some reason. I haven't taught a class in a month, I guess. Uh, you've got milling. So, um, milling again is that kind of final step before export. You have dried seeds. The seeds still have the shell or the parchment attached, right? They have the shell around them, and the actual green coffee seed is within this shell. We need to get that parchment shell off, get those seeds cleaned, sorted, graded, and bagged up so they can be exported. So here's our flow chart for it. Oh, who is milling? Kind of like who is processing. Um, who is milling? The producer may be milling if they have a mill. So this is what we see in Costa Rica, micro mills, where producers grow coffee, they process coffee, and they have their own mills that they export the coffee out of. Um, but more often, it's going to be maybe an association or a cooperative. So again, a group of producers who have a facility together, a dry mill collector or supplier, different names for different areas of the world, but it's basically a place where coffee that has been processed and dried is delivered to be milled and then exported out of. So there's kind of like contracts for that step to happen, right? Those different delivery points. Or again, an exporter, right? These dry mills, collectors, suppliers, exporters, they could be government or private owned. Um, Again, lots of changing of hands could happen. Milling steps. So after that coffee is dried, it is delivered to a mill who collects it. They will sample that coffee and then store that coffee. Typically, it's better to store a coffee in parchment up until it is sold. Once the coffee is sold, then it will go through the milling steps and export immediately. Parchment is a good protective layer for coffee, so it's good to keep the coffee in parchment rather than milling it immediately and then storing it that way. It's just a little safer to store it in its parchment. So you'll store it. Once the coffee is sold, clean off the parchment, or you'll clean the coffee, pull off the parchment, polish, which is becoming less common, sort the coffee, bag it, and export it. So we're going to look at each of these steps real quick here. So collecting the coffee. The coffee is processed and dried. Wherever that coffee is coming from, it will be received at the mill. They will sort that coffee and then warehouse or silo that coffee until it's sold. During this time, while it's stored, some coffee will be pulled from those bags to be sampled, right? Those samples will be shipped or cupped, trying to find a buyer, right? So they'll pull the sample, they will mill the coffee. I'm actually going to turn off the sound because this is really loud. But this is a tiny little mill, right? It's like another depulper where it's just grinding off those husks, grinding off that parchment. And then you get the green coffee seeds. So mill it, screen sort it, right? So screen sorting is basically like we saw in that washed video. It's like a screen with holes in it, and you will shake the coffee through these screens to kind of get the ratio of larger, medium, small size seeds. A lot of times, different lots will just want certain screen sizes. So you'll find out what percentage of this sample is too big or too small to make it to the final lot. Then you will green grade that screen sorted coffee, right? Looking for any defects, visual defects, right? Whether it's bug damage, over fermented, blackened, or immature, chipped, broken, these different visual defects. So you will then find out what percentage of this sample is defective versus acceptable. And basically with all of that, you'll determine like what the final lot size is, right? So screen sorting and defect sorting, you'll determine the final lot size. Then you'll sample roast, cup that coffee, evaluate it, send off samples to sell that coffee, right? So you're kind of getting all the technical data on the coffee while it's in storage to sell that coffee. Once the coffee is sold, it's time to mill the coffee. So that coffee will be taken out of storage, right? So in this small mill, it's a nice little blueprint to show all the different steps. There's a receiving hopper. So the coffee will be dumped into here. It's taken by elevators to the hulling machine. This huller is connected to a pre-cleaned vacuum. So it is pulling dust and any small debris out of that coffee. The coffee is getting hulled, removing the parchment layer. A pneumatic conveyor will continue to kind of sort that coffee, sort out any stones, metals, materials like that. There might be a magnet attached to this pneumatic conveyor to pull out any metal material. And then there's a handful of sorting machines the coffee might go through, depending on the mill. This is another area where new technology, new equipment is coming out all the time. So there could be a screen sorting machine, a density sorting machine, which is kind of those tables that shake and separate coffee by weight. It's a way to get rid of defective coffee. Same with screen sorting. Then there might be an optical sorter, which uses imaging technology to kind of take pictures of the coffee and kick out anything that's too dark or too light in color, right? So all of this is ways of getting rid of any defective coffee or too small or too big of coffee. There might be hand sorting at the end, maybe not, depending on what machinery is there. And then collecting that coffee and bagging it up for export, right? So here's some pictures of each of those steps. Pre-cleaning could be a vacuum, gravimetric table, destoner, a magnet, different ways to kind of clean those seeds before it's being milled, pull out any debris. Then pulling the coffee, getting the parchment off, right? It's kind of like a grinder that just chips away the parchment, getting the green seeds out. and then sorting that coffee, right? Lots of different sorting mechanisms. Density sorter, a table, density being weight, screen sorter, right? Setting the parameters to get certain screen sizes out. Optical sorter, here's a video of an optical sorter. So you can see in that video, like coffee is kind of going down these chutes. Pictures are being taken and little puffs of air being used to kick anything out that doesn't sit in the parameter that you've set on the computer. Hand sorting and bagging the coffee, loading it up for delivery to the port city, right? To where it's going to be exported. So lots of steps in milling. The main thing with milling is the more friction and hulling, the harder it is on the coffee, right? So new machines are very good at trying to eliminate heat and friction because that can damage the coffee. You also want the coffee to be at a good drying point, and for it to go quickly through these steps right before export. So wrapping up the entire class, basically, there's the big flow chart kind of everything we've talked about, right? After harvest, you got washed honey natural, different steps, fermentation points. Then you've got the drawing, all the different variables we talked about there. Then you've got the milling steps, right? So next class, we get into the commercialization of coffee, right? The actual selling the coffee, coffee markets, exporting, importing, all that sort of stuff. This is where our class ends for today. But to me, to kind of put a bow on everything we've talked about, when I think about processing and milling, as those steps or those actions taken to achieve whatever desired end there is for that coffee. It's a series of biological miracles, right? This plant that kind of came to produce a seed that tastes good when you roast it and brew it, right? These biological miracles between plant, between man, between a man's environment, the microbes in that environment, and all of these steps taken, right? All of that in the kind of the name of changing and preserving that coffee, and all of that contributing to the emergence that coffee is. It's like my favorite word to describe coffee as emergent, right? All these properties joining together to create something holistic, something new. And coffee is always providing us with a new experience, right? So this these post harvest steps are huge in kind of adding to that complexity and that potential of what a coffee can become, right? So, closing thoughts, processing and milling transforms and preserves coffee. There's an infinite combination of actors, variables, and outcomes from these steps. And I hope you learned something new or a new way to think about these steps, right? You might know a lot about these steps already, but hopefully there's a new way to think about it there, or it helped define something more clearly or helped you visualize a step more clearly. So if you have any thoughts on anything you want to learn more about related to this, again, I'm going to drop these helpful links here. I'd love to hear from you. We have a survey form too. We'd appreciate your feedback link. If you want to fill out a survey for me, I'd appreciate it. Like I said, these classes are going onto our YouTube. You can watch them there. They're also on our ED+U homepage. And then if you want to read any of the references from today, here's a full list. If you go to the download the presentation, you can copy and paste any of these references, and you can go and check them out yourself. I made sure all these ones, um, they're accessible, and you can go through and read them, and they're kind of broken down by section we went through. So yeah, highly recommend checking those out if you want to learn more based on what we talked about today. But overall, thank you all again. I'm happy to hang out and answer questions. If you have any questions, if you don't, I'll let you go right here. But yeah, I really, really appreciate you all.